Hi everybody, I'm Ryan. Today we're going to talk about standard Naya, I guess you might be able to call it 5-color ramp. This is a great deck if you want to kind of slide away from playing Fable the Mirror Breakers and Blood Tithe Harvesters and Shieldreds, which is kind of one of the only other options in standard, to be totally honest with you. And it has a pretty okay matchup against the deck, just being able to go over top of their mid-range very quickly. So let's jump into it. Let's talk about the strategy, talk about the card choices and things like that. So this is Naya Ramp. The lands are pretty straightforward. We're playing a lot of the 3-mana lands, both because we don't have early plays and we can kind of still play things on curve even though we're playing a lot of tap lands, but also so that once we have a ton of mana in the late game and we draw those lands, they're not dead cards, we can just cycle them. Similarly, having a card like Menace to dump our mana into is really valuable. Also, more than once, it has been the blue for my Atraxa. And we need a lot of basics because our ramp cards fetch out basic lands. And Ossification cares about basic lands. Speaking of, Ossification is our first removal spell, which is the first category of the deck. And I'm going to take just a second and put these into different categories. So Ossification is this first removal spell. Enchant a basic land you control. Consequently, we already want to play a ton of basic lands. When it enters the battlefield, exile a creature or planeswalker an opponent controls until Ossification leaves the battlefield. Amazing unconditional removal. The big downside of Ossification, which is going to be a downside of Leyline Binding as well, is that Invoke Despair kills it. So it ends up being kind of valuable to have an Ossification or a Leyline Binding on a token so that you can sack it when you get Invoke Despair, because them getting stuff back pretty much all game is kind of rough, right? Speaking of Leyline Binding, is the same thing but creatures, but it's instant and often costs 1 mana because it has Domain. The spell costs 1 less to cast for each basic land you control, and all of these tri-lands are every basic land type. So, you know, between searching out cards with our ramp spells and playing tri-lands, very often we have one of each basic land type. So we have a flash 1-mana enchantment that exiles a non-land permanent an opponent controls. We're playing 2 Sunfall in the main deck. We also have 1 in the side. Sunfall, 5 mana, exile all creatures, incubate X, where X is the number of creatures exiled this way. This is really good against these go-wide decks. I also think it's kind of fine against the red-black deck to just kind of hit the reset button after they do a bunch of stuff. 5 mana board wipe that leaves something behind is kind of what this deck's looking for. 5 mana is no big deal for this deck. And we're playing for Archangel of Wrath. Archangel of Wrath is really cool because 1, it has lifelink and flying, so it can apply pressure, but also it can kill creatures. This is fine against red-black, but you're mostly playing this for the soldiers deck and whatnot, because one way to beat decks like this, decks like Ramp, is to go underneath them. One thing to note about Archangel of Wrath too is you cast it for 6 mana with a black and a red, and deals 2 damage to any target twice. That damage that you deal has lifelink, so you will gain 4 life total if you deal 2 damage, plus it's a flying lifelinker blocker hanging back. You really cast 1 of these against soldiers in addition to anything else, the game is pretty much over. The next category we're going to be looking at is the ramp cards. The ramp cards, the first one is Topiary Stomper. 3 mana, 4/4 with Vigilance. Enters battlefield, you get to put a basic land card from your library onto the battlefield tapped, but it can't attack or block unless you control 7 or more lands. Plot twist, we get to 7 or more lands really, really quick. So very often just a 3 mana 4/4 with Vigilance that is also a ramp spell, which we feel great about. What gets us even more basic lands is Invasion of Zendikar. When this 4 mana battle enters the battlefield, you get search a library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. And then also, if you get into a situation that you want to flip it, you know, being able to have the extra creature sometimes is valuable. Very often, you're just using this as a ramp spell, though. Also, of note, this Topiary Stomper and Invasion of Zendikar can hit basic land types that you don't already have to make Leyline Binding cost less, or just hit basic lands in general if you're getting flooded on the tri-lands or Mirror or whatever for Ossification. We're playing 2 main deck Reckoner Bankbuster. Reckoner Bankbuster is very powerful. Reckoner Bankbuster allows us to, 1, have a mana sink, which is really important in the late game if they answer the cards that we're ramping into, because we can pay 2 mana, tap it, and draw a card. We can do that 3 times, and then we get a 1/1 pile and a treasure. And just allows us to kind of dig into this. The issue with decks like this is there are 2 sides to your deck, and it's really important that you hit both sides of your deck in order to actually win games of Magic. And so if we draw the ramp side, but not the creature side, we can play Reckoner Bankbuster and be able to draw a bunch of cards and be able to hit those targets, and vice versa, as long as we have a few lands to be able to start activating. And the big thing, the whole point of the deck is the targets. We have 3 separate targets in this version of the ramp deck. The one we're going to talk about first is Herd Migration. Herd Migration is a 7 mana spell that has Domain. Create a 3/3 green beast creature token for each basic land type among land types you control. By the time you get to 7 mana, that should say 7 mana, create 5 3/3s. which can end the game against a lot of decks. The neat part about this, though, is that it helps us hit our land drops really, really early in the game, because we can discard it and pay 2 mana to search our library for a basic land card, reveal it, put into our hand, and then shuffle and gain 3 life. So we can hit our land drops, make sure we live. This card sort of acts on both ends of the spectrum as far as this deck goes. Incredible addition to the deck. The big target for the ramp is Atraxa, which is a 7-mana spell, 7/7 flying Vigilance, Death, Theft, Lifelink. When it enters the battlefield, you reveal the top 10 cards of your library for each card type. You may put that card of that type from among the revealed cards into your hand. Put the rest in the bottom of your library in a random order. So those are card types. So these are artifacts, battles, creatures, enchantments, instants, sorceries, lands, etc., etc. We run all of those in our deck, I guess, besides instants. So when we play Atraxa, we hit a lot of cards, often another one of these targets, and we keep chaining these targets, be able to chain this ramp, be able to do a bunch of stuff behind Atraxa. Atali is kind of our 2-of-off ramp target. When it enters the battlefield, for each player exiles cards from the top of your library until they exile a non-land card. You may cast any number of spells this way among non-land cards exiled this way without paying their mana cost. That's really good. You know, we get to play this card, and then we essentially 3-for-1 because we get a random card off of our deck and out of our opponent's deck. And it's a 7/7 trampler in and of itself. And we can pay 9 mana and a Phyrexian Green, or 10 mana, to flip it into a trample indestructible 11/11, essentially with Infect. When it deals damage, they get that many poison counters. So it can end the game even if the front side does not end the game. As far as our sideboard goes, we're playing 4 Lithomantic Barrage because, like I said, one of the ways that you lose is by people going underneath it. This allows us to deal with the Soldiers deck pretty easily, and is actually not very bad against like the Blue Tempo deck and things like that. We're playing another Reckoner Bankbuster for these games that we expect to go really long and expect to answer our first target and things like that. Be able to get this down on turn 2, draw a bunch of cards, and be able to go just like, you know, ramp target, ramp target, ramp target, I win. Unlicensed Hearse for these graveyard decks, especially these Reanimator strategies. Sunfall, again, for these when they flood the board with creatures, you know, be able to just deal with that and have a board wipe. Tyrannix Rex is often for counter decks or decks that we know are going to go long, that we know we're going to be able to ramp, and then we might run out of targets. You know, it's really good to play. And then we're playing Vanquish the Horde, just as more board wipes for these super go-wide decks like Soldiers, because you really don't want to lose to that. 2 mana destroy all creatures is pretty good. So if you liked this video and liked learning about Naya Ramp in Standard, please be sure to like and subscribe. Check me out on social medias. Links are above me and in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.